In this video we are uncovering which final boss is the best in the Soulsborne games. And yes, this does include Elden Ring Night Rain and Sekiro. You can harp on me all you want in the comments. First though, we need to define what a final boss is and what the difference is between a final and a true final boss. I define a final boss as any boss fight a player could complete that would trigger the game's end, aka the credits, without necessarily having to be the absolute last fight that could end the game. An example of a final but not true final boss would be Gehrman the First Hunter from Bloodborne. A true final boss is always the last one that can trigger the ending of the game, which means the player would have to usually complete more content, or make a choice or follow specific directions to get to a true final boss. If we're sticking with Bloodborne, then obviously the example here would be the Moon Presence. In this video we're ranking all the final bosses, not just the true final bosses, from the base games. I don't count DLCs, because while most people can agree which boss is the quote-unquote final for most DLCs, it's not as clear-cut as it is in the base games, where you have credits roll, etc, etc. Now I'm going to be basing my choices for the spot of each boss on two criteria. The first and most important one is the actual mechanics of the fights. Is the fight enjoyable, action-packed, is the difficulty appropriate? Obviously you expect the final boss of a difficult game to be appropriately challenging, but without going overboard. Does the fight incorporate specific mechanics shown in the game? Does it force you to utilize skills you have gained while playing? The second criteria is the setup and lore of the final boss. Was the boss set up and hinted at by the game? Does it make sense that I'm fighting this boss in this setting? Does it lead to a satisfying conclusion? All that stuff. The lore isn't as important as the gameplay, because this is not a lore ranking video, but it does play a role. I'm using a tier system here with 5 tiers this time instead of my usual 4. I'll explain what each tier represents as we go along. We have 12 bosses to cover, so grab your Estus and let's get into it. Starting with the F tier, which pretty much just means the bad bosses. We only have one boss here, and I'm pretty sure most of you can guess which it is, so let's not beat around the bush. True King Allant, the final boss from Demon's Souls, is my choice for the worst final boss of all the Soulsborne games. And look, I can already feel the comments start coming in about how quote-unquote it makes sense for Allant to be like that, and that quote-unquote it's the point of the fight, and all that stuff. Now look, from a lore and setup perspective, this fight is pretty good. Allant turned to the old one, the overarching demon enemy of Demon's Souls, in order to end all humanity, apparently. The demon's power twisted his body and turned it into the grotesque monstrosity that we fight at the end of the game. He's meant to represent the pathetic hollow shell of a once great leader who succumbed to his own melancholy, which is why it's very fitting that we fight him at this state. The King Allant we fight at the end of the first Archstone is just a demon fashioned in his image from when he was at his prime. But my question is this: why did True King Allant have to be the final boss of the game? Again, I expect an epic and challenging fight to conclude my arduous journey, not this walking pile of turds. Foregoing an actual fight for lore is fine, just don't do it at the goddamn end of the game. The first time I played Demon's Souls, I honestly thought this fight was just a warm-up for the actual final boss fight. You know how Midra had his human form, but then you actually had to fight his possessed form, which was an actual proper boss fight? But no, the game just ends after this. Why couldn't we fight an avatar of the old demon, or hell, even the demon itself? Hell, even fighting the Maiden in Black would have been much better. Oh, but the demon is too powerful to be fought by mere mortals. Well, we fucking do the same thing in Bloodborne with the Moon Presence or the Elden Beast in Elden Ring. Put some MacGuffin in the game that allows us to stand up to the demon and have the demon be the final fight. Not this goober. Anyway, I rate this fight a disappointment out of 10. Let's move on. C tier is up next, and this represents the okay or average final bosses. At the bottom of the C tier we have Mergo's Wet Nurse from Bloodborne. Mergo's Wet Nurse is one of the 3 potential final bosses of Bloodborne, and if I had to sum it up in one word, it would be underwhelming. There's nothing here that really screams out final fight. In fact, I'd say that Mergo's Wet Nurse is one of the easier fights in Bloodborne. Aside from its design, it sort of looks like a fallen angel, and that's pretty cool, not gonna lie. As for the mechanics of the fight itself, like I said, it's a fairly easy and straightforward fight. The boss will mostly use its many blades that it holds with its many arms to attack you. Side dodging is usually pretty effective and gives you ample opportunity to counter. The continuous blade spinning attack is dangerous, but you can just gain some distance from the boss while waiting for the attack to end. The only interesting attack here is the one where the boss creates a clone out of itself and fills the arena with a dark mist. Honestly, I just always wait this attack out and avoid its attacks as best as I can. This boss isn't tanky or anything, it doesn't have a lot of HP, it just has annoying attacks. As far as lore goes, there's really not much to work with here, as there's very little information on Mergo's wet nurse. We're not even sure if it's considered a great one. Some sources, and for what it's worth, Google's AI overview, consider it a great one, which I'm not gonna lie, kinda makes this boss fight even more disappointing. I'm assuming it's some lesser form of a great one and not at the level of Mergo itself or the moon presence. It obviously serves the role of protecting and nurturing Mergo, which is an infant grade one, but as to why it does this and what its intentions are, we don't have any clue. When I'm fighting it, I have no idea why I'm fighting it or even what I'm fighting. So yeah, interesting lore but doesn't really explain anything and kinda disappointing fight from a gameplay perspective, which is why Mergo's wet nurse sits at the bottom of the C tier. The next spot goes to Aldia, scholar of the first sin who is apparently a guy, even though Aldia is 100% a girl's name. Anyway, not here to judge, though I will say that he looks almost exactly like the slime from the Shin Megami Tensei games. I want to talk about Aldia's lore before we get into the fight itself. Aldia is one of the most important characters in Dark Souls 2, and hell, you could even say that he's one of the most important characters in the whole universe of the Dark Souls trilogy. Aldia was King Vendrick's older brother who became fascinated with the undead curse and researched it as much as he could, performing experiments on both the undead and living people, apparently. Aldia is referred to as a scholar, because he is exactly that, a scholar, a philosopher. He questioned the idea of relinking the fire and prolonging the cyclical nature of the world. He wanted to transcend that. He's not even an antagonist in the traditional sense, more of a voice of ambiguity in Dark Souls 2. His role is actually very cool. And this leads to the biggest criticism I have with Aldia's boss fight, which is that the boss fight shouldn't have existed at all, in my opinion. I get that Aldia is more or less testing you to see if you're worthy to take the throne, but I honestly think that fighting him isn't really suitable for his character. He's a philosopher and a scholar. He's here to push your intellectual and moral buttons, not test your might. The fight is, to use the scientific word, lame. It's as simple as running up to him, getting a few hits in, then gaining some distance to avoid getting burned, avoid his fire projectiles and branch attacks, and then repeat the same thing until he dies. I mean, if you're going to include him as the final boss of the entire game, at least make the fight cooler, you know? Anyway, that's it for Aldia. Really cool lore for the character, not so cool as a boss fight, and also no strong reasoning as to why we have to fight him at all. Up next we have the other final boss of Dark Souls 2, which is Nashandra. Now, Nashandra might not have as cool of a backstory as Aldia, but her fight is definitely better in my opinion. Nashandra will use either melee attacks or her laser attacks if you're further away. It will be pretty easy just to stand close to her and dodge her melee attacks while you punish back, if it weren't for the fact that she also periodically summons spheres that cause curse buildup if you're anywhere near them. This attack will force you on the run, or of course you can just tank the curse buildup, which adds a layer of complexity to an otherwise fairly easy and straightforward fight. It's not a great fight by any means, but it is significantly better than Aldia's. Nashandra was the original final boss of Dark Souls 2, while Aldia was added in the Scholar of the First Sin edition. As for her lore, Nashandra is mentioned several times and is built up quite well throughout the game. You even meet her in her human form in the Drangley Castle. Now, Nashandra is an aspect or fragment of Manus, Father of the Abyss, the final boss of the DLC of Dark Souls 1. She served as the sort of puppet master and manipulated Vendrick in order to gain control of the kingdom of Drunlake. But since that wasn't enough to satisfy her wants, she then turned her attention to obtaining the First Flame. Vendrick eventually realized her true nature, so he tried to prevent her from getting to the Throne of Want. But Nashandra manipulates the Bearer of Chaos, that's you by the way, into doing her dirty deeds. You get the King Ring and the Giant's Kinship, which gives you access to the throne, and then of course she betrays you and tries to take the power for herself. Obviously you'd kill her because, let's be honest, she's not much of a threat, and that's that. Her lore is solid, there's a clear reason as to why you're fighting her, she has a good setup in the game. The only problem is that she's not a particularly menacing or threatening boss. I think being at the top of the C tier is a good enough spot for her. Moving up to the B tier now, which basically encompasses the good but not great final bosses. For the bottom of the B tier we have Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, aka the biggest bitch in the entire Dark Souls trilogy universe. Gwyn was the Lord of the Gods who came to power after the First Flame appeared, which helped them take down the Everlasting Dragons. But nature is cyclical, all things eventually come to an end in order to make way for a new world to prosper. The fire was starting to fade. Rather than accept this fact of reality, Gwyn committed the first sin and tried to artificially prolong the First Flame, for example having the Witch of Izalith trying to extend its lifespan, only for her to be consumed by the flame and create chaos. After all his previous attempts failed, Gwyn was like,
I'll do it myself.
And he sacrificed his body to prolong the Age of Fire. The state that you fight him in is the perfect representation of his choices. Instead of fighting a kingly and majestic lord, you fight what seems to be the meth head from down the block. Gwyn's fear of a new world and inability to let nature take its course is the precedent for the entirety of the Dark Souls franchise, in which the inhabitants of the world are manipulated or coerced to relinking the fire and delaying the inevitable. Gwyn has been described as a tragic character, but I think the adjective that best describes him is coward, unable and unwilling to let go of his time in the sun. The fight itself is pretty fun. Gwyn is one of the better bosses in Dark Souls 1, which admittedly isn't saying much considering that Dark Souls 1's bosses kinda suck. He's fast, brutal, and barely leaves any room for punishing, especially with Dark Souls 1's slower movement. But he does have a fatal flaw, which pretty much everybody knows of by now. Gwyn is susceptible to parrying. And when you get good at parrying Gwyn, it pretty much trivializes the entire fight. Hell, the parry window isn't even that strict. Sure, you can always choose not to parry Gwyn and fight him normally, but the fact that you can trivialize this fight removes some of its weight. But overall, the fight is pretty cool. The lore and representation of Gwyn is excellent in my opinion. Yeah, pretty good fight overall, with the only aspect keeping it back being the parry thing. Up next we have Emma the Gentle Blade and Isshin Ashina, the final boss of the Shura or bad ending of Sekiro. To get this boss fight you have to choose to betray Kuro and give the dragon's blood to the owl, which is clearly the wrong choice considering Kuro has been nothing but kind to you, while the owl is a manipulative, lying asshole. But if you end up choosing this, Emma, the physician that was responsible for training the blacksmith as well as upgrade the gourd, will be like, nah bitch, and will fight you to prevent this. Emma herself is pretty easy as a boss, all things considered. Her attacks are easy to read and parry, she has a grab attack but honestly that's not too much of a concern. All her attacks have easy tells and she's very aggressive, so being aggressive as well is a good strategy. After Emma is dead, the old man Isshin himself will step in. Now Isshin is a legendary samurai and his power, especially in his prime, is referenced throughout Sekiro. Unfortunately, you don't get to fight him in his prime in this case, but it's still a cool experience nonetheless to fight the old man even in his retirement. While not nearly as difficult as his true final boss version, Isshin is challenging in this instance too. He's more defensive than Emma and thus you need to be more patient for opportunities to attack him. He doesn't utilize lightning in this fight, but he does use fire attacks, which is pretty cool, not gonna lie. I think these two sit pretty comfortably in the middle of the B tier, because you can't help but compare them to the true final boss fight of Sekiro. Up next we have the Moon Presence from Bloodborne. Now, I'm just gonna come out and say it, in my opinion the Moon Presence has the best lore and setup out of the entire list. The whole concept of you fighting what is essentially a deity in the universe of Bloodborne is extremely cool. And we're not talking a lesser great one like Murgo's Wet Nurse or an injured great one like Abridas. No, this thing is a powerful, high-tier great one. Its purpose is not well understood, but it is the creator of the Hunter's Dream and seems to be trying to eliminate other great ones, using the Hunters as its puppets to enforce its will. It is a Lovecraftian horror with goals and aspirations beyond the grasp of a lesser being's mind. But the kicker is, we get to fight it. Of course, it's not that simple. A mere hunter would normally stand no chance against a being of such power, which is why if you deny German's request to escape the dream and defeat him, the Moon Presence will take control of you and you will be powerless to do anything about it. However, if you had consumed 3/3 of an umbilical cord beforehand, then this changes things. These items are relics from other great ones and consuming them allows your character to sort of ascend to a new plane and crucially, gives them the ability to resist the Moon Presence and even kill it. The setup to the fight is excellent. The Moon Presence is subtly hinted at throughout the entire game, with the presence of the Blood Moon, as well as seeing a reference to quote-unquote hunting the Great Ones, which is presumably what the Moon Presence wants. Its concept is very cool, though to be fair, it doesn't look all that distinct from other horrors found in Yharnam. Aside from that, the only issue with this boss is the fight itself. If you had never played Bloodborne before and I had you fight all the bosses without context, you probably wouldn't be able to tell that this is the true final boss of the game. It really doesn't feel like a final boss fight. I mean, it's not a pushover, but it's not too challenging either. The boss is fast-paced and erratic, similar to many beast bosses in Bloodborne. It will mostly use melee attacks, some of which are somewhat tricky to dodge. It also has an attack where it shoots blood. Its ultimate attack is pretty cool. It will instantly reduce your HP to 1, after which the boss will be passive for a few seconds, allowing you to regain a portion of your HP back by attacking it. It's a cool concept that highlights Bloodborne's unique HP siphon mechanic. But honestly, it just makes the fight easier. I mean, you get a ton of free hits for God's sake. All for the low price of maybe using one blood vial if you don't manage to recover that much HP. So yeah, incredibly good concept and lore, mediocre fight. Let's move on. For the top spot of the B tier, we have Radagon of the Golden Order and the Elden Beast. It pains me to have to put this fight here because it had all the ingredients to easily be on the S tier. This is a two-part fight. First you fight Radagon, which is unironically one of my favorite fights in the entire game. He is fast and punishing, but also fair and masterable. His attacks are meant to catch you off guard, sometimes using finishers in his combos, and sometimes not. He is best fought up close and personal, as his ranged attacks are a bit trickier to avoid. His teleportation is also very dangerous, as it leaves behind a small AoE explosion and can easily catch you off guard. The second part of the fight is the Elden Beast, and this is what's keeping this fight from ranking higher. It's a fairly boring fight, even though on paper the Elden Beast has tons of different attacks and combos. It has melee attacks, fire breath, homing projectiles, explosions, distracto disc, and of course its ultimate, during which golden circles will encroach you and you have to quickly run away while jumping over the circles to get out of the attack area. The problem though is this boss's gigantic HP pool, which makes this fight a huge slog. The Elden Beast isn't really all that difficult per se, it's just a huge endurance fight. Now, as far as lore and setup goes, it's not too bad. To understand it, we need to delve a little bit into the lore of Elden Ring. In a nutshell, the Greater Will, an outer god, sent the Elden Ring to the Lands Between, the world in which the events of Elden Ring take place, to establish its order and rule. Queen Marika is selected as the vassal of the Greater Will, and thus she takes the Elden Ring, becomes a god, though not as high in caliber as the Greater Will obviously, and rules the Lands Between. Eventually she consorts Radagon, who is a champion of the Golden Order, which is weird as it's revealed that Marika and Radagon are in fact the same person, or at least share the same body. How they were able to conceive? Well, you'll just have to use your imagination for that. Anyway, eventually Marika became disillusioned with the Greater Will and thus shattered the Elden Ring, in an event called the Shattering, which brought the whole world into discourse and started a free-for-all between all the demigods as to who would claim the ring next. The lore is obviously much deeper than this, but in essence, Marika is punished by the Greater Will and was crucified and trapped inside the Earth Tree. When we eventually arrive at the base of the Earth Tree, we first see Marika, who then turns into the form of Radagon, thus confirming the hypothesis that Marika and Radagon were in fact the same person. We don't actually fight Radagon himself though per se, rather his husk that is controlled by the Elden Beast. Now the Elden Beast is basically an avatar of the Greater Will itself. It is the manifestation of the Elden Ring. It's like a representative of the Greater Will, or at least that's how my brain understands it. So the lore and setup is actually pretty good. The Radagon fight is also very good, but the Elden Beast fight holds this boss fight back. I will say that I really like the Elden Beast from an aesthetic standpoint, but as a fight, yeah, it's kinda boring. Moving up to the A tier now, which only has one member, as in my opinion the top 3 bosses are easily S tier material. For our sole member here, we have Hailstor the Night Lord from Elden Ring Night Rain. Hailstor is easily my favorite Night Lord from Elden Ring Night Rain, and by extension, my favorite boss fight. This is a two-part fight. In his first phase, he starts off as a relatively slow and passive boss. He does have tricky combos though, which require practice to nail the correct dodge timing. Some of his attacks are quick, while others are deliberately slow to catch you off guard. At about 50% health in the first phase, he pulls out his second greatsword and his melee attacks become harder to dodge. The real challenge comes in the second phase though, where in addition to his melee attacks, he starts incorporating magic projectiles, homing missiles, and a magic rush attack. His ultimate attack is the Reality Reaper, which will cause a massive AoE blast of a random element and will also cause the earth to constantly erupt in random spots, which makes this fight even harder. This boss is exactly what you'd expect a final boss fight to be like. The music is great, the presentation is great, also he wields the Moonlight Greatsword, gotta give him points for that. In terms of lore, I'll be honest, it's all pretty vague and my monkey lizard brain can't comprehend most of the theories out there, but apparently Hailstor was a fallen knight who combined with a sort of cosmic entity called the Infant, which was actually created by the Recluse. But she apparently didn't love it, so it got pissed off and started destroying everything, and at some point merged with Hailstor, and this created the Night Lord. I do like the fact that Hailstor, as in the Night Lord, is tied to each Nightfarer's personal objective, which gives the fight a more personal spin to it, rather than you just being a random dude who fights gods for no apparent reason other than the fact that your waifu told you to. So why is Hellstorm not in the S tier? Well, it's due to the nature of Elden Ring Night Rain itself as a game. In Night Rain, your setup and team composition plays a huge role when it comes to the challenge and enjoyment of a Night Lord fight. If you go in very well prepared, you can have a very easy fight, especially nowadays where most players already have a pretty good understanding and grasp on how to play this game. If you go in at a high level with holy damage, this boss can be kind of a pushover, which is what is preventing him from reaching the S tier. Yes, of course you can just choose not to use holy damage to make this more of a fair fight, but similar to Gwyn, the fact that you can stop on this guy sucks a bit of the epicness out of this fight. But it's still a great final boss fight. Alright, and we have now reached the S tier along with our top 3 final boss fights. Now, instead of just announcing them in order like I did so far, I think it's more fun to talk about each one in no particular order and then at the end decide which takes the top spot. Well, I already decided. Tell you guys what I decided. Cool? So let's grab these guys chronologically, which means our first contestant is Gehrman the First Hunter from Bloodborne.
Tonight, Gehrman joins the hunt.
Undoubtedly the best of the 3 potential final bosses in Bloodborne, Gehrman's fight represents more than a badass hunter vs hunter fight, although it is also that. Gehrman is your wise old companion and even mentor throughout your journey in the horrors of Yharnam. He resides in the Hunter's Dream and he was the very first individual to start fighting against the Scourge. Gehrman is also the reason why the Hunter's Dream exists. In his despair from losing the woman he loved, he turned to a Great One, the Moon Presence, and asked it to bring life to a doll, the waifu, which he fashioned to look like his beloved, Lady Maria. But Gehrman was bound to the Hunter's Dream by the Moon Presence, with his only desire now being that one day he might be freed. And this is why this fight is so important. Gehrman only fights you if you refuse to leave the Hunter's Dream. My man is only beating the shit out of you because he doesn't want you to squander your opportunity to leave. He doesn't want you to be trapped here like him. At least that's one interpretation to his motives, though it seems the most likely to me. Either way, he's a fantastic character in a fantastic game. The fight itself also delivers on the great build-up. Bloodborne does humanoid bosses very well, and Gehrman is one of the best and hardest ones. Fighting Gehrman is like finding yourself, only stronger and cooler. He has 2 quote-unquote modes. In one he is dual-wielding his scythe, which gives him heavier but somewhat slower attacks and a bigger reach, while in the other one he wields a shorter sword as well as his gun, which he can use to shoot at you. He can also buff himself and cause a fairly large explosion when he does so. I don't have a lot to say about this fight, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is an epic, fast-paced one-on-one hunter vs hunter fight, and it is incredibly fitting as a final boss fight. However, I do have to say one thing. Gehrman does have a pretty big weakness. Parrying. As a humanoid boss, Gehrman can be parried. Now, parrying him doesn't exactly trivialize the fight the same way it does with Gwyn, but on the other hand, this is Bloodborne, so parrying is easier and safer compared to Dark Souls 1. But again, even with parrying, this is still an awesome final boss fight. After you beat Gehrman, you kill him and finally set him free from the binds of the Moon Presence, letting the old man finally have peace. For our second choice, we have the Soul of Cinder from Dark Souls 3. Now, unlike Gehrman and our third and final option, the Soul of Cinder isn't actually a character. It is instead the embodiment and manifestation of all the people who first linked the flame to prolong the Age of Fire, starting with Gwyn and potentially ending with you. It is as if the flame itself decides to fight you, to test your worthiness in guiding a new world. Because at this point, you are literally deciding the fate of the whole Dark Souls universe. Do you link the flame again, doing as instructed, as so many of your brethren did before? Or do you finally snuff it out, allow the Age of Fire to close and nature to finally take its rightful course? That is the decision you have to take, and that is what the Soul of Cinder is testing you on. You can only prove yourself worthy to decide the fate of the world by defeating all the previous ones that came before you. As a boss fight, the Soul of Cinder is one of the best and most challenging fights in the game. It swaps between 4 styles of combat: the straight sword, the curved sword, the lance, and the staff. The straight sword mode is straightforward, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. The boss will use varied combos with both very fast and very slow attacks to catch you off guard. In the curved sword mode, the boss will be utilizing pyromancy as well as very fast melee attacks. This is the hardest mode of all to counter. Seriously, you can barely land any hits safely in this mode. The boss's attacks leave way too little openings. It can also shoot a poison mist that I'm confident never actually poisoned anybody. In the lance mode, the boss will, well, use its lance to attack you. It can close gaps very quickly with its rush attacks and can also use incantations such as force and even heal itself. This mode is also very hard to counter. Finally, in staff mode, the boss will use a variety of sorceries like Homing Soulmas, Soul Greatsword, Soul Spears, etc. This is the easiest mode to counter and it's a great time to rush the boss for some easy hits. In phase 2, the boss will only have one mode, which is basically Gwyn but tougher. Its 5-hit combo will decimate you if you get hit, because you will be unable to move and you'll get hit by the entirety of the remaining combo, which ends in a fairly big AoE. Other than that, the boss will use several of Gwyn's moves like the grab attack, the bitch kick, as well as his slashes. It can also throw lightning at you, as well as summon several homing bolts of lightning from above. This phase, in my opinion, is actually easier than the first phase. What's great about the Soul of Cinder is that it feels like a nod to the entirety of the Dark Souls trilogy. The boss uses a lot of familiar attacks and moves from both enemies and even player characters. But this doesn't actually feel like cheap referencing. It earns the right to reference the crap out of the trilogy due to its lore and build-up. When you defeat the Soul of Cinder, you now have the opportunity to decide the fate of the world. Will you continue the Age of Fire? Will you let it die out to make way for the Age of Dark? Or will you take this power for yourself? The choice is yours. You've earned it. And while yes, you did have a choice in both Dark Souls 1 and 2, it feels more significant here because this is actually the end of the franchise. Probably. There's not gonna be a Dark Souls 4, guys. It's not happening, sorry. And finally we arrive at Ishin the Sword Saint from Sekiro, the true final boss of the game and arguably the hardest fight of the entire game. Ishin is the adoptive grandfather of our arch-nemesis Genichiro, and is considered by many to be one of the greatest swordsmen Japan has ever seen. We get to speak to Ishin on several occasions during our playthrough, first as the masked Tengu who asks us to kill all the spies located in the castle's outskirts, and then several times in his quarters throughout the progression of the story. He also likes to drink. I mean, who doesn't, right? He pretty much embodies the grizzled old veteran who now likes to drink and talk about his prime archetype. What's interesting about Ishin is his disposition regarding Ashina and the difference between his philosophy and his grandson's. Genichiro is all about might is right and make Ashina great again and all that jazz. He is willing to go to any lengths to protect Ashina and see it prosper, including using the very taboo power of Dragon's Heritage to create an undying army of soldiers. He feels like it's his duty as the leader. Ishin, on the other hand, while obviously caring for both his grandson and his home, doesn't want to cross that line. It seems like he's content with the fact that Ashina is pretty much lost anyway, and doesn't want his grandson to fall into depravity chasing an idealistic dream. At the final fight, we get to fight Genichiro once more, in the same valley where the game begins and where Genichiro had cut our arm out. It's all very poetic. Once we best Genichiro, Ishin himself sprouts out from within him, which is definitely a normal thing that people do, and challenges us to a final epic duel. The implication here is that Genichiro sacrificed himself and is somehow forcing Ishin to rise from the grave, because yeah, apparently Ishin died before the end of the game, to fulfill his goal. So Ishin is kinda forced to fight us, honestly, but I like to believe that he's also kind of, oh cool, I'm resurrected in my prime. Well, gotta put this new body to the test, am I right? I think at the end of the day, Ishin is a samurai and he wants to test his might against a worthy opponent, for no other reason than the thrill of the fight. The fight here is absolutely amazing. Ishin has 3 health orbs. Adding the one that Genichiro has in the beginning, that is a 4-phase fight, the only one in the entire game. Ishin is incredibly fast, has tons of different combos, several unparable attacks, he can shoot at you. On phase 2 he grabs his spear, which gives him access to a host of new attacks, as well as a bigger reach. This dude is absolutely packing. My favorite thing about this fight is that Ishin will put everything you learned in your playthrough to the test. This is Sekiro, so obviously parrying is your go-to move here. However, there are times where you should dodge or jump specific attacks. In the final phase, Ishin will use lightning. So if you haven't mastered lightning redirection, you are going to suffer in this phase. On the flip side, if you can redirect lightning, then this will give you a huge advantage as you'll be able to momentarily stun Ishin and deal some damage back. This fight is the culmination of all the experience and skills you've accumulated throughout your journey. Truly an epic fight to end an epic game. He even goes out as a boss at the end. He just straight up tells you to finish him. He has been satisfied with having one last fight and being bested and just says, what a fight. Alright, and that's it for the top 3 players. Honestly, any one of these bosses has the right to be considered the best final boss in my opinion, but I do have to pick one. But before I tell you my choice, go ahead and pause the video and write in the comments which one you think it's going to be. No cheating. Alright, ready? My pick for the best final boss in the Soulsborne games is Ishin the Sword Saint from Sekiro. Why Ishin? Well, because I think his fight feels the most fitting in terms of mechanics. Like I said, this fight feels like the culmination of your entire journey of Sekiro. The Soul of Cinder might feel more grandiose, and Gehrman might have more interesting lore and closer ties to you, the character, but Ishin's fight feels the most perfect for a final boss fight. For me anyway. But again, all 3 of these guys have similarities that push them to the top of my list. They are all very challenging, engaging fights that are thematically appropriate, and have very satisfying endings. Oh, and in case you were wondering, Soul of Cinder is at number 2 and Gehrman at number 3. Yeah, remember when I said that I wasn't going to mention these guys in order? I lied. And there we have it guys, my ranking of all the final bosses in all Soulsborne games. And Sekiro. And Night Rain. Guys, let me know your own best final boss, or hell, even your entire list down in the comments. If you like this video, then liking the video really helps me out. Subscribe or the moon presence is going to eat your souls, and hey, maybe even check out this recommended video next if you liked what you saw. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.